Hi, we're talking about Your Money Matters on NDTV Profit, and my name is Alex Matthew. A very old statement is that when two elephants fight, the grass suffers. And this is playing out in the healthcare space. You have an association of healthcare providers which has decided to stop accepting Bajaj Allianz policies for cashless services. Now, if you are new to the healthcare space and if you're unaware of how health insurance works, this will not make a lot of sense to you, but a lot of people will know that a cashless facility is where you go to a hospital and you don't have to pay out of pocket. Because you have a health insurance policy, they will treat you in the event of a hospitalization based on what you have on your policy, based on the cover that you have. Now, if you are a Bajaj Allianz holder or policy holder, you don't have this available in a number of hospitals. And this is over 15,000 hospitals in India. We'll talk about what you should do if you are a customer. And we'll also use this opportunity to talk about health insurance in general. And joining me is Vishal Dhawan, the founder and chief executive officer of Plan Ahead Wealth Advisors. Vishal, thanks so much for taking the time. Let's talk about the issue first, right? We did speak with the AHPI representative, and they have certain contentions. And of course, the company is hopeful of a resolution. I believe that there is some conversation, but it's unfortunate because the customers at the end of the day suffer.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge because what tends to happen is when you do end up having a hospitalization that takes place, you do want to spend your time focusing on helping with the treatment and the recovery. And very often, making decisions around what's the right course of treatment itself can be very stressful because there could be alternative approaches that are suggested by doctors. And you need to go through finding the right doctor, finding the right treatment, getting, the ecosystem prepared for all of that. And then on top of that, you have to deal with money matters. Now, what tended to happen with a cashless facility, obviously, is that it tended to allow you to focus on all the other items and do away with focusing on the financial aspect of it, at least to a certain extent. And obviously, because the bill settlement was happening directly between the insurance company and the hospital, um, some of the more technical questions that could arise when uh, uh, a customer was interfacing could get solved easily because insurance companies and hospitals could speak the same language. So I think when it does go away, it certainly creates a lot of additional stress beyond the normal stress that would anyway arise in these kind of situations.
It's important to talk about all of the aspects that you've just described in a little bit more detail. And it's a great opportunity, despite the fact that we're speaking about this unfortunate situation, to help people understand why cashless is important, why health insurance itself is important. So, Vishal, in your experience, when you go out in the case of a hospitalization without a cashless service, what is the kind of situation that you find yourself in? Because you have to have money, first of all, available with you, because a hospital, though they're not supposed to ask for this, will ask for a deposit. If it's not a state-owned hospital, if you go to a private hospital, they can deny you treatment if you don't have the money available to you. Is that right?
Yeah, so typically hospitals will ask for a deposit, to be made available immediately. And obviously, what ends up happening is that you have to have access to that money, and this becomes even more critical when you have unplanned hospitalization events. When you have planned hospitalization events, let's say there's a surgery for which you have, you know, gone into talking to a doctor. The doctor said, I plan to do a surgery next week, etc., etc. It's a very different process as compared to when you get into an emergency situation. Maybe it's the middle of the night, and there's been an accident in the family, or there's been a heart situation that seems to have arisen. So I think the approaches can be very different if you're planned versus unplanned. But nevertheless, whether you're planned or unplanned, you need to have money available. And therefore, the important thing that cashless procedures actually ended up doing is very often they allowed you to deal with the planned ones extremely well, and the unplanned ones also reasonably to a better extent because of the fact that there was already a tie-up between the hospital and the insurance company. I think where um, a lot of stress gets created by the event itself, I think the financial aspect sometimes can just move that stress to a very different level. And you then need to have money lying around. Very often, you need a credit card, for example, to be able to access to make your original initial payment, or maybe you have liquidity lying in your bank account, um, so that you can do a UPI transfer. Maybe you have, actually cash available with you, which you can use for that payment. So I think there's a lot of processes involved, but clearly at the start, you need to be putting out some amount of money so that the treatment can happen in the manner that it's supposed to happen.
Yeah, important point. And so therefore, to draw the conclusion from what you've just described, it gets very complicated when you don't have cashless. That should be the first priority, to utilize cashless, to utilize a health insurance policy, because it opens a lot of doors for you right up front in the case of an emergency. Of course, in the case of a planned treatment, as you've pointed out, you have more time to plan. But when you're talking about cashless and when you're talking about selecting a health insurance provider, should you be aware of the network of hospitals? Should you be aware of which hospital you would go to in the event of an emergency?
Absolutely. I think there are, some things that are well done or better done when they're planned well. And, you need to plan for emergencies also, as much as it makes it sound strange because, you would say an emergency is an emergency. So how do you plan for it? But you can do certain things. For example, very often when you have emergency health situations, time is of great essence. And therefore, you need to know what are those hospitals that are in your vicinity, which would become your ports of first call, because you want the treatment to start as quickly as possible. And in certain kinds of treatment, as you'd be aware, there are things like golden hours, etc., in which you need to get to the hospital and start the treatment. Um, what you also want to do at the same time is know that there could be preferred doctors that you have for treatment, and those doctors may be affiliated with certain hospitals and not be affiliated with other hospitals, and therefore sometimes your choice of which hospital to go to would also be driven by the choice of doctor or medical professional that you want to deal with. And obviously, if your network of cashless hospitals and the hospital and the doctor that you work with are all in sync with each other, saying that, okay, this doctor is associated with this hospital is a part of the network for this insurance company, then it makes your life much easier because everything is in sync with each other. If not, then obviously there are ways out of it where you go out and do a reimbursement claim because you say that, oh, getting to a hospital was more important than it being a network hospital. I will figure out how to make the payment initially and then get a reimbursement by giving the bills, etc. But I think it's important to think through how this would happen. And I think for a lot of people, they also need to keep in mind that they may have an independent health insurance cover, which may have a certain set of network hospitals, and then they could have a company cover or a corporate cover provided by their employer, which could have a different set of hospitals on it. And therefore, which of those insurance covers are you likely to use would also dictate how this process will work. And all of this is not possible to do instantly when an event happens because you're trying to focus on the patient. And that's why some of this planning in advance, maybe even speaking to family members saying, this is what we are thinking about. Let's say if something happened to me, this is what I'd like you to do. If something happens to you, this is what I'm thinking should be the approach to be taken. Are you okay with it? And I think that way the decisions can be very quick.
Yeah, and time is of the essence, of course. That goes without saying. I will circle back to what to do if you don't have available cashless facility. But to that end, what should people who currently have a Bajaj Allianz policy do? Should they look to port? It's not the easiest thing to do, is it, Vishal?
Yes, I think it's not easy to do it. And what we need to keep in mind is that, by porting, you may not be able to permanently solve this problem because the list of network hospitals, for example, can change over a period of time. So there are hospitals which can go out of a network. There can be other hospitals that come into a network. Similarly, you could end up in a situation where there could be times where a particular uh, insurance company, like Bajaj is facing right now, is not being given cashless. But that doesn't mean that a similar sort of thing could not happen to other companies as well. And therefore, what we need to keep in mind is that this is a moving item. And therefore, for you to be able to continuously port may be hard, because today, if you port from Bajaj and go to someone else, you might find that you run into the same problem with another insurance company at some point in the future. So you need to keep in mind that you'll have to do two things parallelly. One is build your own independent emergency fund solution to take care of events of this kind which can happen, because you also need to remember that porting can only happen 45 days before your insurance premium is due. And therefore, let's say if you just paid your insurance premium to Bajaj and your next premium is due only 1 year later, then what do you do for the next 9, 10 months is the question that needs to get answered. So I think porting may not be as simple a solution as possible, and therefore you might have to look at the other alternatives to see how this can sort of come through. Uh, and that's where even your company cover could be valuable, because a lot of times when we speak to families, they do not have enough information itself about their company covers. They don't know who's the provider, which is the network hospital, who all are covered, to what extent they're covered, how does it work in case there is an emergency. So I think a lot of this itself is missing, because somehow it always appears that emergencies will happen to someone else but will not happen to me.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. I couldn't have said it better. So therefore, the point that you've just made, in the case of those people that have these policies, you might have to look outside of the network, right? For those that might just give you cashless. And beyond that also, you might want to build up on an emergency fund or bolster it till this resolution is found. But let's talk about how that is constructed, because Vishal, it's not the easiest thing for a lot of people to do. And I've often asked this question, and frankly, I don't think that I've gotten the best solution here, right? Because if I go to somebody who's 25 or 26 years old and I tell them, look, you're going to have to save 6 months worth of your expenses, they have universally looked at me funny. And they've said, what do you mean? I can't take care of this week's expenses. How do you expect me to set up that kind of a fund? Is there an answer here?
I think it's a real challenge, because what ends up happening is, obviously when you're younger, your probability of having that emergency for yourself reduces. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but it just is a lower probability. And I think that's where it's important for family structures to be thought about in the right manner. So you could find that there could be families where there are dependents. There could be, parents, for example, who need to be taken care of. In those cases, the question really is that, who's expected to create that emergency corpus? Is it the 25, 26-year-old, because he's the only one who's the earning member, and the dependents or the parents or older are not earning? Or have they created their own emergency corpus for these kind of situations already? I think what we find very often is that families are not talking about this enough, either because it's a slightly sensitive area where you talk about things which are unpleasant, like a medical emergency, or it happens simply because everyone's assuming the other person's doing their job and their role. And therefore, there is no consolidated view being taken of this. And therefore, you could end up in a different situation as well, where two sets of people are taking two emergency funds and building it up parallelly. And therefore, as a family, you have too much emergency provisions getting created as compared to what you required. So I think the thought that you need to um, take a very nuanced and a careful decision on this cannot be underestimated. I think the way to think about it is, once you've understood dependencies, how much corpuses have already got created, you now start to look at pre-existing conditions. Obviously, if there are pre-existing conditions that exist, let's say there's a diabetic in the family, someone has high blood pressure, someone's had a cardiac history, etc., then the need for this buffer may need to be larger simply because the probability of something like an emergency happening could be higher. No one knows whether it will or not, but the probability increases. And therefore, the way we think about it is anywhere between 3 months going all the way up to a year, maybe the tiered approach that families take. And one of the things that we found work well for younger people is that, if you tell them that first create the first 3 months of emergency, I think they don't have the patience for that. But if you tell them that out of every, sort of rupee that you save, can you put a part of it aside towards your emergency fund? And therefore you keep bolstering this over a period of time. And hopefully, the emergency doesn't come up so quickly. I think the acceptance is much higher when you tear this out rather than try to do it all in one shot.
So to that end, how do you go about it? And where would you put this? Would you put it in different buckets, even within that emergency fund? And use, I know a lot of people use liquid funds. Some people are gravitating now because of tax purposes towards arbitrage funds. I don't know if that's the best idea because you would want to keep it very liquid, and arbitrage is T+1, right? Is it not? Or is it T+2?
T+2.
Yeah, T+2, right? So therefore, you need to have availability of funds very quickly in the event of an emergency. And also, should you put your credit card into that? Because ultimately, a lot of people say that you should go and swipe your credit card in the event of an emergency.
Yeah. So I think there are many different ways that people can use it. And obviously, a lot of this depends on um, preferred approaches. So for people who have credit cards which have decent limits on them as well, I think a credit card initial swipe is a good idea because what it does is it gives you access to the money immediately and allows you to focus on the core issue, which is getting the treatment started for the patient quickly. The challenge with credit cards is, of course, if your limits are already used up, or you tend to use this as a more permanent solution rather than just an immediate liquidity solution, saying that, in the next few days, while the treatment is going on, I will find the other sources so that I can pay off my credit card as quickly as possible. I think that's important to be clear about, saying use the credit card first, but use it very prudently and allow it not to roll over because the cost of the credit can then otherwise be extremely expensive. Now, while this is happening, there are different approaches that people can do for their emergency fund provision. So either it could be a liquid fund, um, or it could be a savings account which has a linked fixed deposit to it. So there are these accounts which have a sweep in, sweep out facility where the money goes to a fixed deposit and then comes back out of it if needed. There could also be the use of arbitrage funds, like you mentioned, or there could even be investors who are using short-term debt funds, um, saying that the volatility on the instrument is going to be very low, and I don't know when this emergency is going to happen. So, rather than being in a liquid fund instrument where my rate of return will typically be lower, I'm okay to park a part of it into a short-term debt fund as well. What some people also do is they create credit lines. For example, against a fixed deposit, you can create an overdraft credit line, which will only come into play in case of an emergency. So there are different approaches that people can take, and there is no one size fits all on this because it depends on the tax bracket of the individual. It depends on their own discipline of using that credit line only for emergency purposes and not using it for shopping, for example, saying that for me right now, shopping at Ganpati is an emergency because I need this new wardrobe, I need to travel, or some of that. So I think that there needs to be a very customized approach taken to the emergency fund without not creating the emergency fund because you're confused. I think our suggestion to people is that if you're confused, give up a percent or two of returns and just park the money aside so that in the case of emergency you have money available.
I love that you said that with such a straight face. The unavailability of clothes in your wardrobe during a festival is an emergency. It certainly is for a few people, but I guess from the perspective of managing your money, the emergency we're talking about is very different. Vishal, final point, and this is going to put all of what we've spoken about into context. Ultimately, people have limited resources, And so they have to put things in an order of priority. And we've discussed health insurance, we've discussed an emergency fund. How do you layer that in the order of priority? Of course, a lot of people say that you need to have health insurance even before you think about investing.
Yeah, so we certainly agree with that thought that there is a need for health insurance to be there. And I think the important part about health insurance is also to define how much health insurance do you need. I think one of the things that we see happen very often is that sometimes there are tick-offs that happen just saying, do you have an emergency, do you have a healthcare fund? A health insurance policy? Answer is yes. The question is it adequate? If you're in a large city and you have an emergency which is large in terms of healthcare requirements, is a 50,000 rupees or a 1 lakh rupee cover going to be enough? So I think you need to get to getting the right amount of health insurance as well. Do not depend completely on your company health insurance cover, um, because of the fact that you may not always be employed, and there can be times where you're between career shifts and therefore exposed if something happened to you. It's also important to keep in mind that health insurance is not just for you, but for everyone else that you may need to support financially if an event happens. So it could be spouse, children, parents, in-laws, siblings if they're dependent. So you need to look at all of that comprehensively. Once you've got the health insurance piece right, that's your way to knowing that hopefully my finances will not get into a mess because of a health emergency. Now I have to address the liquidity issue, which through a cashless process I could have addressed because I could get the cashless to take care of it. But if I don't have cashless, then I need to ensure that I can get liquidity available. Or there might be certain things that my health insurance company does not cover at all. Certain illnesses for a certain period of time, or within the expenses as well, there may be certain consumables which are not covered, etc. So that's when it becomes important to start thinking about your emergency fund as well. And we need to keep in mind that emergency funds have multiple uses. They're not just for healthcare. They could be because you lost a job. They could be because there is suddenly someone who's very close to you who requires some money, and you need to step in to support it, or would ideally want to support it if you could. So that emergency fund is not just a healthcare provision. It can be used for multiple purposes. And then you get to investments. Like I said, for a lot of people, doing this one after the other can be very stressful. So for those sets of people, sometimes you may choose to do this concurrently, though it's not ideal.
Got it. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining in, Vishal, and for speaking to me on this show.